Thank you all so much for joining us this evening for a live conversation with director Marcus Clarke and Dr. Todd Boyd discussing their new Netflix documentary, Blood Brothers, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. This is a film that just debuted on Netflix on September 9th, so it is currently available. The conversation will be moderated by MFA candidate Nana Adwoa Frimpong from the School of Cinematic Arts. And if you want to ask a question, please just type it up and put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And as soon as we open it up for questions, Nana will go ahead and read your questions. And I hope you all had a chance to watch and enjoy the film. So welcome everyone. I will turn it over to Nana at this point, and thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, Marcus. Hi, Dr. Boyd. Nice to meet you and to be in conversation with you.
How you doing? Thanks for having us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
It was such an experience watching the film, so I'm really excited to ask you all the questions and really get into it. But first for you, Marcus, how did you come to this film, to this story in particular?
Yeah, well, you know, Kenya Barris and Lightbox production company here in Los Angeles, they bought the rights to the book Blood Brothers, written by Randy Roberts and Johnny Smith. And, you know, they were looking for a director. And my agent actually connected me with Aaron Sampson, one of the executives for Kenya. And they told me about the project. And to be honest with you, you know, I didn't actually know about the friendship. I didn't know how deep the friendship was, how significant it was. And so, you know, a lot of the process with this film was really kind of finding the relationship and discovery. And so, you know, in the early research for the film, I had found two clips, one from Malcolm X referring to Cassius Clay as his brother, another from Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, referring to Malcolm X as his brother, two separate clips. And, you know, I really saw this as something that was really compelling and really showed that this relationship was real and actually very deep. So I got really excited about it, and I kind of pitched my perspective on how I would tell the story and how I'd approach the film, going through some of the regret elements that I know existed, because Ali had written that in his book, Soul of the Butterfly. And so I kind of presented my approach, and soon after that, I was hired for the project, and we were off to the races from there.
Mm-hmm. I'd love for you to speak more to how you got to your approach, because I've heard you speak about, you know, you were named after Marcus Garvey, who is included in the film. You grew up in Brooklyn. And how did your identity or your specific experiences inform how you wanted to approach this story in particular?
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely a big part of it, was like, how do I bring some of my own culture, my own heritage, my own upbringing into the film in a way that's natural, in a way that's authentic. And, you know, the Marcus Garvey element was already part of the story. It's already, you know, part of history. Malcolm X's parents were part of the Garvey movement. His mother was a writer for Garvey's newspaper. And so it was something that was really personal and dear to me to kind of elevate that and amplify that part of the story. And, you know, that happened, that process of making the film and working with Kenya, you know, he really challenged me to dig deep into myself in that way, and to get really personal and personalize it in a way that made sense. And that challenge really is how we got to how that segment of the film really plays out. The Garvey influence in his early life, and shining a light on the Garvey influence kind of in the last chapters of his life, with what he was trying to do overseas. So that's how we got there. And that's something that I feel is incredibly important to the story, and understanding who Malcolm was and his philosophy and kind of, you know, the influences that he had growing up and how that inspired him.
Yeah. Dr. Boyd, I'd like to ask you, because before we got on, we were talking about the number of docs that you are in this month alone. What about this in particular? First of all, how did you two connect? And then what was it about this story in particular that made you want to sign on?
You know, I spend my life these days responding to interview requests. So some time ago, I must have heard from Marcus and his people, and you know, I mean, it's Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. You can't really say no to that if you're Todd Boyd. I mean, you know, like listening to Marcus talk about his own personal experiences, I've had the good fortune of being able to spend my professional life writing and talking and researching, figures and subjects that I grew up very interested in long before I, became a professor or went to graduate school and studied it formally. So for me, it's very personal. I mean, I'm from Detroit. The Nation of Islam was started in Detroit. My father had a great story about when he was a kid, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Master Farad Muhammad coming to his house to speak with my grandmother. And I'm like, you remember that? He's like, oh yeah, of course. He goes, I was little, but when I got older and I saw Elijah Muhammad in the Nation, I remembered that's the guy who was, speaking to my grandmother. So, there's that piece of it. The Nation was started in Detroit. My father also attended a very famous speech that Malcolm gave, maybe his most famous speech, the Message to the Grassroots, in 1963. And my father's the person who turned me on to the book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X. And when I went to graduate school, he gave me a vinyl album of that speech, Message to the Grassroots. And, I went to graduate school in Iowa, so I really needed that album. Malcolm was a part of my life because of these sorts of things. And I later devoted a great deal of time and attention to sort of studying Malcolm and the Nation of Islam. And, Ali, when I was a kid, I remember the lead up to the Ali Frazier fight. And I was very young. This fight was 1971. Honestly, it's one of the first things I ever remember on television was this guy, Ali, who I just couldn't stop paying attention to. It was almost like he was going to jump through the screen. And I remember my parents went to go watch the Ali Frazier fight. Back then, you had to watch a fight on closed circuit television, and the closed circuit viewing would be at movie theaters. And I remember they got dressed up as a big deal. And when they came home, I was really young, but I was so excited. I wanted to know who won. And when they told me Joe Frazier won, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand how Muhammad Ali lost. I'm like, this guy can't lose. Like, years later, I went to graduate school, and I was always interested in this connection between politics and culture and sports. And, long story short, or longer, depending, in 2016, when Muhammad Ali passed away, CBS flew me out to New York, and I was the commentator during Ali's funeral that entire day. And I consider that one of the highlights of my career is the fact that this guy who I saw when I was a little kid, here I am, they called on me and asked me to comment during his funeral. So, I say all this to say when Marcus and, his crew reached out, what am I going to do? No, I'm not going to let you interview me about something I could probably spend 3 weeks straight talking about without interruption. I mean, it was a no-brainer.
And in the doc, you speak about the moment that you saw Muhammad Ali and Sonny Liston fight, and it gives you goosebumps, like when he says, "I shook up the world." What was it about that fight in particular for you?
Well, I mean, Ali's legacy as a boxer, of course, intertwines with his legacy as an activist, as a cultural figure, as an icon. It's an incredible story, and Marcus does a great job, telling both of these stories in the film. But for Ali and Malcolm, really, the connection doesn't fully materialize until Ali's first championship fight against Sonny Liston in 1964. And some people over the years who taken classes from me have heard the lecture about this incredible fight. These fights, these Ali fights, are like, chapters in a great novel. I mean, they're so dramatic and poetic and just, I mean, they're just everything. And so here's his first fight against Liston, and everybody thinks Ali's out. He's going to be, destroyed. Sonny Liston, I call him the first thug. I mean, he's a guy who came out of the penitentiary. He learned to box in the penitentiary. He got out of the penitentiary so that he could work for the mafia. He was a leg breaker, as I say in the film. I didn't realize it till I watched the second time the other day that I dropped a rhyme in that clip. But, Liston, everybody just assumes Ali's going to get destroyed. Ali's this young guy who people really don't take that serious. He's won the gold medal, but Liston is not only knocking people out, but kind of putting the fear of God in people's heart the way Mike Tyson would do in the 1980s. Mike Tyson is very much indebted to the legacy of Sonny Liston. And in the middle of this fight, if you'll indulge me, to sort of tell this story, there's long been this story that Sonny Liston's corner poured blood thinner on Liston's gloves. And so when Liston punched Ali, he got blood thinner in his eyes. So there's a round and a half of that fight where Muhammad Ali literally is blind. He can't see. And eventually the perspiration kind of washes his blood thinner out of his eyes, and he, goes on to win the fight. When you get to the end of it and they're all standing there and they're waiting for the next round and Liston doesn't come back, and you can just look at Ali and he starts doing what, comes to be known as the Ali shuffle. And as I watch him do that, all of a sudden they announced Liston's not coming back, new heavyweight champion, and he picks up the pace on that like Ali shuffle. And then he goes around the ring and he points, and he's pointing because so many people doubted him. And he's like, I fooled you, and I fooled you, and I fooled you. And when the announcer and Joe Louis, the great, former champion, come over to interview him, he's so amped up and he's just yelling, I shook up the world. I shook up the world. I'm pretty. I'm a bad man. That was, I mean, talking about it it's emotional. It's it's really emotional because that was triumph against all the odds. And I think that's why it hit me. And, tears of joy, like just thinking about it, it's just magnetic, what it means in terms of American history, what it means in terms of my own personal history. So I've seen it, I don't know how many times. If you show it to me right now, look, I can't even tell a story without getting caught up. So it's just, Black man won that day.
That's right.
There are several emotional moments in the film. And Marcus, I'm curious for you, what your approach to editing the film was, because I mean, you have these complex characters with these complex relationships. It's a love story. It's a story about brotherhood, so many themes. And so how do you, build an arc for the many subjects in the film? How do you tell their truth honestly?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's definitely one of the challenges that went into the film. I have to give credit to my editor, Jeremy Seifer, who's incredible, who really worked with me to build out that arc and the structure of the film. And it's particularly difficult because in this situation, the relationship was extremely private. Not a lot of people know about the relationship. There are not a lot of people to talk to. And of course, this is 56 years ago. And so really to structure the story, each individual, each person who's sitting with us is carrying a certain portion of the story, what they know best, so to speak. And so creating that structure was definitely challenging, but I think we pulled it off. But that's kind of how the film naturally found its form, which is, I wanted to present a film that was balanced between the legacy of both men. That was something that was really important to me. Getting the family involved was really important to me. And so, naturally, the story started to shape itself because, only certain people can speak about certain moments, really. No one in this particular instance, no one person has the whole story. And so it was really important to allow the guests to kind of play off of each other, to kind of pass the baton of the story as it's being told and as it's being unfolded. And then, we managed to get the interview with Rahman Ali, which was really impactful and incredibly important. One, because it gets us really close to Muhammad Ali, he's the closest you can get to the actual relationship. He was there, he lived it. And he's really the emotional anchor of the story. And so while I had a concept for how I thought I was going to tell the story, it wasn't until we got the Rahman interview that I really knew exactly how the story was to be told. And that was, he was going to be this, this emotional through line, if you will, almost like, your grandpa telling you a story one day. You know what I mean? That's the feeling I wanted people to have. Come closer, let me tell you a story. It's like that kind of sentiment. And so, he's older, so and he's had several strokes, so it's a little bit difficult for him to communicate. But it really worked. And it really kind of gave a good sense of how complicated this relationship was. Again, he shows a range of emotions. He has admiration for Malcolm X and for the relationship they had, for Malcolm's influence on both of them. He has love for that. But then again, when we get to the issues of betrayal, he's still very angry and very upset and really shows that anger and that frustration. And at the end of the film, it kind of, I don't want to say it breaks him because it doesn't, but he becomes very emotional because, he's just gone through all these different emotions and feelings and he's kind of reliving it. And I feel like that, that humanity is really important to show people and to really show the complexity of the relationship and how hard this must have been for Muhammad Ali to navigate. People forget that he was a young man, in his 20s, in his early 20s when this is happening. Malcolm X, 17 years older than him. So he had a little bit of, not little, he had more wisdom and more insight on the world, on the working of the Nation of Islam, on the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. And so all of these things, I think, really come across in the structure of the film. But the editor was really important, obviously. The way we were working together was really important, but there was definitely a natural flow to the process because only certain people could naturally speak to certain things. I really didn't want to allow any of the guests, respectfully, to step out of the bounds of what they actually know about. And that's something we had to be really conscious of, only letting people speak to what they're experts in.
Yeah, and I've heard you even talk about how you wanted to make sure that Malcolm X spoke for himself, Muhammad Ali spoke for himself in the film. And so how did that come into conversation when it came to looking into the archives? What you picked, how did you approach going into the archives?
Yeah, well, first, the first mission of the archive was to really outline the relationship, right? Which is to really mine, and again, I'm going to give credit to my archivist, Julianne Galdames, who was an expert archivist on this and in general, but really being able to mine all the photography, all of the clips in which they're together, in which their paths overlap. The book was really helpful for that in a way, because Johnny Smith and Randy Roberts, they did extensive amounts of research on this, cross-referencing all the previous books and publications, all the FBI surveillance documentation to say, where were these men when did their paths overlap, which kind of gave us a bit of a roadmap in terms of like where to look and what to look for. But it was a lot of hard work in terms of culling and mining all that material, calling news outlets that don't exist anymore, getting film transfers from formats that they used to record in 1960s that we no longer use. And so there was a lot of process in there from the National Archives, the Schomburg, Ilyas Shabazz licensed us a bunch of footage and photos as well. And a lot of these are very rare and haven't been seen before. And so, as much as there is in the film, there isn't that much, to be honest with you, there isn't that much. And so we really kind of threw everything we could and tried to organize it into a timeline. And so that was kind of our first steps in terms of outlining the relationship. And then to give color to that and to, what's really bringing them together, which is this philosophy of the Nation of Islam, which is Elijah Muhammad at this time. That led us to some of that archival material as well. And for me, it was important to show, if the thing that really binds them is this philosophy, right, is this faith, it was important for me to show, what was it about the faith that was appealing to these two men? Why did both of these men gravitate to this organization? And what did they gain from it? What did they glean from it? What did they learn from it about themselves and about the world? And so the pieces that you see from Elijah Muhammad, especially in the lead up to this relationship, is really to underscore what was the proposition, what was the promise of the nation at that time, and what did they see in it, and why would this be something that is attractive to Black men in the 60s? And that's something that I don't think can be overlooked. When you're talking about the 60s, 62 to 65 in particular, their message was incredibly compelling at that time to some Black people. And yeah, it was also alienating to other Black people as well, to be honest. Some of the rhetoric was definitely problematic, but this was definitely appealing to them, and that guided kind of some of those clips that you see from the nation in terms of why we were using those and how we structured that.
Love to talk to you both about time and representation, because in the film, Dr. Boyd, you say that the Ali that has been presented since 1996 is a fake image. They've edited out what made him controversial in another era. How do you think time, for both of you, how do you think time shapes or reshapes our understanding of iconic figures? And Marcus, even for you, as you move throughout the film and you had all these interviews with people, how did your understanding of what you were talking about, what you were unpacking, changed?
Yeah, to be honest, I definitely went through something in this process of the interviews, of all the things that I've learned about both of these men. It hasn't changed my opinion of them, to be honest. They're still my heroes. Muhammad Ali is still a hero. Malcolm X is still a hero, in my opinion. I think we have a greater understanding of their humanity and some of the challenges that they were facing. But one of the questions I asked all of the interviewees was, how does time change the legacy of men? That was the question that I believe spawned the Good Doctor's response. And that's something that I think we have to take into consideration, because this effect does happen, right? 1996, Ali is celebrated as an American hero. He is an American hero, but he's celebrated as an American hero. And in many ways, people had diluted some of the decisions he made in the past, or tried to ignore some of the controversial decisions he made. Taking a Muslim name at that time was explosive, kind of unheard of at that time. And so time has this ability in people's opinions, in terms of how the stories are being told, who is telling those stories, has a tendency to change people's opinion on things. And like we've mentioned, this relationship wasn't very well known. The influence of Malcolm X on Cassius Clay Muhammad Ali wasn't very well known. And there's probably a pretty good reason for that. Not a good reason, but there's probably a real tangible reason, which is, Malcolm has been seen as fiery and been seen as intimidating and been seen as a threat. And some of his rhetoric, I think, has been frowned upon. And so he's kind of not gotten his fair due in the history of things, in the history of our civil rights leaders. Certainly not as much due as Martin Luther King. And so I think that, time and who's telling the stories is really important, because in order to tell these stories, when you look back in history, you have to be able to recognize and identify what things are important to these guys and these people to tell their story. It's really important to be able to notice and recognize why Marcus Garvey's influence might be extremely impactful to someone like Malcolm X. It's not a footnote. It's front of mind. And so who's telling the story is going to be really important, because, why have we not heard about this friendship before? Why don't we know about the depths of this friendship?
Dr. Boyd?
Yeah, I think, for me, it's twofold, personal and professional, I guess, which is, kind of the theme I've been speaking on throughout. I remember how people reacted to Ali in the 70s. I remember how people reacted to the Nation of Islam in the 70s. And so around the time that the documentary When We Were Kings came out in 96, 97, you know, a long time had passed and people seemed to now all of a sudden love Ali. But I remembered when they didn't love him, when they hated him in some cases, and certainly Malcolm as well. I mean, you know, Spike's film on Malcolm X from the early 90s, a few years before. And so it was watching this sort of in real time growing up, and then reaching this point when I was an adult in the 90s and a professor, and I was, you know, dealing with these things professionally. And I'm like, okay, you like Ali now, but he's sick and he doesn't talk. And the Ali I remember, he rhymed and he was funny, but he was also very critical of white supremacy in very direct ways. So if you watch the very famous interview he did in 1974 on the Mike Douglas show, when he's debating a Republican senator from Ohio, and it's a really intense debate. He's not biting his tongue. He's going at this guy, and this guy's coming at him. I mean, it's a real intense conversation. And there would be other examples you could find during this time when he's debating people, and he's very critical of racism, white supremacy, et cetera. So it's knowing that Ali, but then seeing everybody like applaud him and, you know, comment on his rhymes, and all that's part of who he is. I mean, the guy had an incredible personality, but it kind of felt to me as though people liked him now that he couldn't talk back. And that made me uncomfortable. And that's why I say what you have seen from, you know, the Olympics in 96 going forward is maybe different than what you saw from the period before that. There's a period of time from the 80s up until the Olympics, really, after he retires, he's not that visible. The Olympics, you know, he makes this comeback to light the torch. I did a panel very similar to this with Ken Burns and Janet Evans a couple months ago. Janet Evans is the Olympic athlete who's actually up on the stage with him when he lights the torch. And she's telling this story about how they were rehearsing this the night before, and he kept dropping the torch. But that night, the athlete kicked in, and he didn't drop that torch. But it's hard to watch him stand there and shake. I talk about this in Ken Burns' documentary, in the Ali documentary, which starts this Sunday. You're looking at this guy and he's in bad shape. But when you saw him 30 years earlier, he was on top. And part of being on top was the ease with which he could lacerate people with his hands in his pocket because he could use his tongue. And so to me, the kind of editing, I call it, of his image from 96, 97 forward is in a lot of cases disingenuous. And so I was thinking about the sort of overall image as opposed to the more user-friendly image that made some people more comfortable with him when he didn't have the ability to respond.
We are going to go to audience questions in just a moment, but before we do that, Marcus, the opening of the film is like, this is the action I'm doing because I don't know if there's a word.
Thank you.
Yes, I don't know if there's a word, so I'm just going to do this. But
yeah,
you start off and you introduce like big themes in the very beginning of destiny, you know, not escaping your destiny, but also one of being free. Cornel West talks about how Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X were two of the freest Black men that we know. And I'm interested in, well, first of all, the placement of that moment, but for both of you, you know, what your opinion is or what your thoughts are on this concept of being free Black men. What does that mean? What did that mean in the context of these two men? And is that is that still possible today?
Yeah, so thank you for your comments about the opening. A lot of work went into that. But these two men, you know, they really did believe in destiny. And so much of the story is a destiny story. You know, some things are, I guess, open to chance, but this is a real destiny story. This is what it's about. And so putting that forward was really important, to set up the stakes and to kind of what you're going to see, because in so many ways, this is like Black Shakespeare. The way, the characters, the betrayal, the love, you know, this kind of the fatherly relationship, the brotherhood, there's all of those elements. And I really wanted to set that up early in the film. But I think it's Dr. Cornel West who sets up how free these men are, as being the freest. And I think that, you know, Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X are two men who give us an example of what freedom can look like when it's fully embodied. And that really takes a certain degree of fearlessness. And these two men were defiant at a time when defiant really means something, when the obstacles around them and the environment they're around is incredibly challenging. And, you know, we're still dealing with a lot of these issues today, but even more so in the 60s, particularly in this time period. And so to have that disposition, to be showing that sense of pride and that sense of confidence, and Malcolm X showing this degree of fearlessness, speaking out against the system, speaking truth to power, speaking against the oppression, and not just speaking against it, but Malcolm X had like this uncanny ability to speak, right? His oratory skills are just next level. And he's incredibly intelligent, but there's something else that he has also that I haven't really been able to put into words, but it's about his ability to break down some of these really complex ideas about oppression, about the effects of oppression, about the psychology of what comes along with some of these images and messages of inferiority. And he's really able to break those things down so that everybody can understand what he's talking about and everybody can really get it and say, oh yeah, he's right. I have been feeling like that. And so I think that, you know, that degree of fearlessness in terms of how he was able to present himself to the world, and subsequently, you know, put the battery in Ali's back so that he would present himself similarly to the world, is something that's incredibly powerful. And I think that's what Dr. West is talking about in that moment, is really just how free they were in terms of how they conducted themselves and giving us a benchmark for what it would look like if our minds were free.
Dr. Boyd, what about you?
Well, you know, if you think about the mid 60s, I mean, people are blowing churches up with little girls in the church, you know. This is that era. Civil rights workers are disappearing, turning up in, you know, makeshift graves, and the people who are responsible for these things are getting off. I mean, this is a different era, right? And so here's this guy in Malcolm X who's basically standing up and saying, like, I have no fear of you. I have no fear of anything. You can't do anything to me. Like, there's nothing you can do to make me stop. And I'm going to say what I have to say. I'm going to say it with style. And it's going to be extremely intelligent and on point. I mean, my whole speaking, I make my living as a speaker. It comes from listening to Malcolm. You know, I mean, he was funny. You know, you listen to Malcolm and you recognize, like, yeah, this dude had control of the street, but he also had control of his intellect, and he merged those things. You listen to Malcolm's speeches, you'll laugh. I mean, he cracks a lot of jokes. But then he'll say something really penetrating, like just deep. And at the same time, he'll say something confrontational, like, I think I say in the film, you couldn't call people white devils, certainly not out loud. And he's giving public speeches, blonde hair, blue eyes, and pale skin. Like this is what he's saying. And he later evolved beyond this, but there was a time when he was like, I'm gonna bring the fight to you. I'm not gonna run away from this. I'm actually gonna pursue it. And, Ali made his living throwing hands. I mean, it's so symbolic. He's a boxer. Like, what could be more symbolic? Like, he was paid to fight. And he's fighting his opponents in the ring, and he's fighting the establishment outside of the ring. So, the freedom, again, Ali was funny. The rhymes, the jokes, but he could flip it and be critical at a real effective level as well. So when I think about what does it mean to be free, I mean, what does it mean to think about yourself as a Black man in American society and to willingly confront all of the obstacles that are placed in front of you from the establishment because of white supremacy, maybe even from your own community. We have to be honest about the fact that a lot of Black people were bent out of shape because, when I was growing up, people would use this word Muslim. They didn't say Muslim or Muslim. Like, this is how they pronounced it. So-and-so was a Muslim. My father, my late father, he described any kind of radical political Black person as a Muslim. It could be the Black Panther Party, whatever. If it was a Black person who was political and they were going against the establishment in a very strong manner, to him, they were a Muslim because that's what he associated with Malcolm and what he associated with Ali. I'll never forget, this is in the late 80s when Public Enemy is really hot. And my father calls me up and he's like, I'm watching these guys, Public Enemy, and I can't make sense of this guy with this clock on his neck, Flavor Flav. And I said, well, you got to ignore Flav. He's silly. I said, but have you heard what Chuck D had to say? And he goes, oh, that guy's a Muslim. Like, it just, when he listened to Chuck D and Public Enemy, it's like, this reminds me of Malcolm. So I say all that to say, freedom is about confronting all these obstacles that are built into what it means to be a Black man in this society and responding to those things effectively, but also, and this is very important to me, with style, because that's part of the culture. You have to do it a certain way. You have to do it in a way that distinguishes you from others. You have to do it in a way that becomes your signature. And both Malcolm and Ali were stylists. In addition to being stylists, they were substantive. And then when you think about the pairing, Malcolm is like, rah, 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 let's do this. If you watch basketball, a good way to compare it would be, some players, every now and then I use sports metaphors. Some players put the ball on the deck and they're trying to drive to the basket and they want to avoid contact. They don't want to get hit. Other players go to the basket in hopes of drawing contact. That's what I like. And I've always tried to, in my approach, I'm looking for contact. I'm not trying to avoid it. I want this confrontation. Let's do this. And I'm talking intellectually. But the way I approach it is as though we were actually fighting, as though we were actually throwing hands. This, I think, you can draw from Ali. And when you talk about Malcolm and you merge the two, I mean, it's like Wu-Tang said, we form like Voltron. It's like the combination of the two of them I'm not so into superheroes. I know that's a thing now. I mean, not my generation, but when I think of superheroes, it's Malcolm. It's
Right.
it's Malcolm. It's Muhammad Ali. I was about to say Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is not a superhero to me. I know he is to a lot of other people. Sorry. But superheroes to me, Malcolm and Ali. And that's because the way that they carried themselves was this sense of whatever you're going to do to me is not going to stop me from trying to achieve my goal. And that to me was the ultimate expression of freedom.
I couldn't agree more.
Amen.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go to the audience questions. So first of all, people are saying this is a phenomenal documentary. It should be required curriculum in all schools and universities. Thanks, you, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you.
Letty Cooper is asking, what is the reason that Muhammad Ali decided to leave the Nation of Islam?
So that's a good, oh, go ahead.
Oh, it's your film. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there isn't a clear or definitive, like, here is exactly why, but what we know is in 1975, Elijah Muhammad passes away. And it's around that time and his next trip to Mecca where he starts to convert to a more traditional form of Islam, that he actually leaves the nation. You know, we can, I don't think he ever said exactly why, but we can speculate that out of respect, he stayed until the passing of Elijah Muhammad. And then after that, because that was really his spiritual father, that was the, you know, the center of his allegiance to the nation. And so I think after that time, he had this transformation and got closer to what you might call traditional Islam. And so I think that was part of the catalyst. And I think that also helped him to, you know, to tap into some of these emotions and some of the hindsight that would be necessary to really be critical about other moments in his life. And yeah, that's what the film presents, and that's what his daughter Miriam Ali speaks to. I believe it was, you know, very much a spiritual transition, and it was influenced heavily by his trip to Mecca.
Yeah, I think, you know, in agreement with all that. Also, you know, because Malcolm left the nation. I mean, they both left the nation. They just did it at different times.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought of the Nation of Islam as, it's like an introduction. And so if you are a Black man of a certain generation, the nation has an appeal to you maybe at a certain point in your life. Like, I remember as a kid seeing the Fruit of Islam in their uniforms. They were like an army, like, and they were always super friendly to me as a little kid. They called me young brother. I love that. Like, you know, and you see them like in these uniforms in formation. It had a strong appeal. And you start to think about, you know, I want to be conscious. I want to be political. I want to do something substantive. Where do I go? And I knew at an early age, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, that just didn't fit my personality, didn't fit who I was, what I believed, or my circumstances. And so I look at the nation and, you know, I never joined the nation, never even got close to it. But it was a way to get me into studying history and culture and politics and having a point of view when doing so. I think what happens is if you're really on it, that may be where you start, but you grow and you evolve. Malcolm grew and he evolved. He didn't get the opportunity to fully evolve because he was killed. The same with Ali, he grew, he evolved. And so at some point, the nation has done a great job in terms of what it has meant to some of the most downtrodden people in our community, certainly individuals who've spent time in the penitentiary. But at some point, I think for other people, they appreciate what they got out of that experience, but they want to go places that perhaps they aren't able to go within that structure. And so there's a certain evolution, I think, that we see with Malcolm, and then subsequently we see later with Ali about leaving the nation.
Marcus, this is another question about the interviews, but did you get any resistance from people, people who didn't want to speak, or they got in front of camera and they're like, can't do it?
Yeah, not in front of camera. Like once people showed up, we were pretty much ready to go. But you know, to be honest, getting the families on board was a bit of a challenge. Maryam Ali is a big part of the film, as is Hana Ali. And Maryam, being the eldest daughter of Ali, was somebody, you know, was really important because she has a very clear memory of her father, and she had these conversations with her father. And so, you know, as you can imagine, every time there's a Muhammad Ali documentary, she's asked to be a part of it. And so there's a certain amount of, you know, fatigue that comes along with that, which makes total sense. So in the very beginning, she actually turned us down several times, to be honest with you. But my producer, Jason Perez, is very persistent. And, you know, he stayed on it. He kept writing her letters, kept phoning her and asking for her commitment. And so it was definitely a challenge, but we eventually got her involved. Similarly with Ilyasa Shabazz, she was a little bit easier to get on board, but we still had to, you know, be very clear about our intentions and what we were trying to achieve. And I think through the questioning, she really got a sense of where I was going, the questions with the interview, and really opened up to us in a way that was, you know, that was incredibly special and very rare. That's where the third act of the film really comes from, is her contributions, opening up about her family and about her sister, her older sister, Attila, who Ali first reached out to form a relationship with their family. And, you know, that's a piece of new information in the doc that I don't think people are aware of or have heard of before. And yeah, so there was definitely, on the family side, there was definitely some courting that had to go into play. You know, we talked about who we were, myself and my producer, Jason Perez, like where we come from, what our families and upbringing is like. We really just kind of put it out there because we know how important it is to have the families involved when you're dealing with the legacies of these men. There's a certain level of authenticity that goes into that, that adds. There's a legacy that adds, and they really are the blood of these men. And so there was something poetic and symbolic in there that was also really important to us. So we never gave up. You know, we kept respectfully. We were respectfully persistent, but that made all the difference, really.
And it's true, and it was so incredibly effective because it felt as though their narratives completed the circle of love. Like it began with love, and then your film very much ends with love, in love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, there are no more questions in the Q&A box, so thank you both for your time and your answers. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, and thank you for having us today.
Of course.
Is there another question coming?
There's not another question, but there's a brilliant comment by Midge Costin, my professor, so I want to read this out. She says, Marcus, fantastic, important film, thank you. What was left out for the sake of time that you most regret? That's one question. And then Dr. Boyd, we are so lucky to have you at USC SCA. You're a national treasure yourself. Is there anything about these two men's relationship or history that you wish were in the film?
Dr. Boyd, you can go first, please.
You know, is there anything that I wish was in the film? I mean, you know, having now done multiple documentaries, and I should say thank you for those really kind comments before I go on. Having done multiple documentaries on Ali and Malcolm, at some point, you know, they're distinct, and at other point, like, what did I talk about in this documentary? They kind of run together. So I have talked about everything that I think needs to be in any of these films. I mean, you could always add more, but I think the film does a really good job of, you know, telling the story of a friendship that, like, people haven't thought about in this way, and just to think of them as friends. You know, I mean, we're talking about two of the most important figures of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. But to talk about them as friends, like, you know, there's something very straightforward about that, simple even, like, you know, hopefully we all have friends. What did that mean? Like beyond the history? I mean, you know, Regina King did that film One Night in Miami about, you know, them all talking after the fight, Jim Brown and Sam Cooke as well. These are human beings. And human beings, you know, of course, develop friendships. And they're also prominent historical figures. But to think about them as friends, I think is just really brilliant. And then to document it. And it's a friendship that fell apart. You know, I mean, so it's tragic in that way. But in the end, you kind of all bring it together. So, I mean, you know, I'm happy to sit down and do a documentary where there's nobody else talking in it but me. But, you know, short of that, you know, I mean, I think they covered it, and they covered it very well, and they offer us an angle into this relationship. Like, when do we think of Black men as friends? Mm-hmm. You know, that TV show Friends, there's no Black people on the show. You know, something as common as that, we don't often lend to, you know, people like this, and certainly not historical figures at their level. So I just think to approach it from that standpoint and to represent it in the way that they did, I mean, you know, there's nothing else to say. But if you're still curious after you've watched Marcus's documentary multiple times, you know, Ken Burns' Ali comes on this Sunday night. It's 8 hours, 4 2-hour episodes. It is Ali, not Ali and Malcolm, but Malcolm, you know, of course, comes up. So the great thing about all this is there's so much material on both of these individuals. I remember a time when this wasn't the case, you know, so this adds to what's already there, and there's a lot there. So, you know, you can't expect one documentary to kind of, you know, solve every issue. But I think if you think about this in conjunction with numerous other books and documentaries, it's well represented. And I think this film adds a very important piece to that conversation that we really hadn't focused on in this way before.
Yeah, and for the question that you asked me, you know, the film is really 62 to 65, right? And these men, you know, have so much that they accomplished in their lives and during their legacy. So there's a lot of different things and directions you could go potentially. I think for this, you know, we were editing against the backdrop of the George Floyd protests going on, and we were in lockdown. And so there was kind of, you know, there was definitely a time in which I thought it would make sense to apply as much as the kind of Malcolm philosophy and speeches to the things we were seeing as possible. But at some point that starts to really distract from the core of what the story is, right? Which is really staying laser focused on this friendship, as Dr. Boyd just said, and this relationship. And so there was a temptation to kind of go further into addressing what's happening today, but I had to pull that back a little bit and instead build that into kind of the subtext of the film. So kind of beneath the layer of just outlining the relationship, you know, there's messages buried in the film, all throughout the film, in the music cues with what's happening in the story, and, you know, with some of the select moments that you do get from Malcolm and his speeches. And so that was something we were mindful of, and that's probably the thing I would say is would be most interesting that was left out, but I wouldn't really say it's left out because those moments don't really point to information about the friendship. They're really just more about how Malcolm was so brilliant at addressing what he was seeing and the origin of what he was seeing and how we need to rally against those things. But it was probably more speeches. But that's a creative decision again. That's how you get a different POV on someone. With this film, there was a good amount of calculation on people know who Muhammad Ali is already. People know who Malcolm X is already. So I had to come to the table with the assumption that there's some type of general knowledge already that the audience is going to have when they see the film. So you're not going to get, as important as they are, you're not going to get the by any means necessary speech. You're not going to get the ballot or the bullet, because you've seen that a million times already. We've all seen that. We know those stories. And there's no harm in repeating them, but for this particular film, it was really important for me and for the team to stay really focused on the core relationship, and not putting in too many elements that would distract your attention from focusing on the relationship.
I think your comment on, situating it in today connects so well to McNor's comment or question, which is, how do you think Malcolm would have evolved if he were still alive today, or Malcolm and Muhammad Ali's relationship? For both of you, do you have any comments on that?
I've been asked that question a lot. I remember, around the time that Spike's film Malcolm X was coming out in the early 90s, someone wrote an article saying if Malcolm X were alive today, he'd be a Republican. And I'm like, and if Malcolm X were alive today and you wrote that article, he might curse you out, but without him being alive, you could speculate anything. Malcolm was, I think, in the process of moving beyond the nation. He had moved beyond the nation. He was evolving as a thinker, as a speaker. And what's going on in America? He gets killed in 65. So 1966, 67, 68, Vietnam, King gets assassinated, anti-Vietnam War protests, groups like the Black Panther Party, Angela Davis. Malcolm is influential on all these things, on all these people. Imagine Malcolm and Angela Davis, being able to work together. Imagine if Malcolm had been around to kind of mentor the Panthers. Who knows? We can't really imagine where he would have gone. Like friendships can do, people sometimes fall out. And if they're fortunate enough to live long enough, maybe they realize at a point in their life later on that what they fell out about, is no longer an issue and they can come back together. Or maybe they never come back together. Maybe it's just from a distance they have respect for each other. It's hard to imagine that they wouldn't have come back together. Ali talks about what he did to Malcolm as being one of the biggest regrets in his life. So, who knows what Malcolm would have become. That's something I don't know that we'll ever be able to answer, but knowing his history and how many times he changed from, a guy who's in the street hustling to a dope fiend to a pimp, a convict, when he first joins the nation, he evolves. His whole life is evolution. So one can imagine that the evolution would have continued and perhaps only speculate on which direction it would have taken him in.
Well, finally, thank you both for such a wonderful Q&A. It was so lovely to speak with you, and I'm just grateful for your time. Thank you, Marcus, for your film. Dr. Boyd, thank you for being here as always. I appreciate you both. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you for the time to talk about this film. I really appreciate us being here.
For sure.